Introduce our next guest.
Yes. All right. So, David Haynes, hello, sir. How are you? He's getting into gamer mode here. I'm gonna make him. Let's see. I got. Oh man, I am way behind here, David. Let's see if I get you here. Make co-host. All right. Let's see. See if that worked, David. And you're on mute, I think.
Hey, can
There
you
we
hear me?
go. Yes. Awesome, David. So I'll do an introduction here. Nice to see you. So
Yeah, you too.
David Haynes, MBA, Vice President of National Practice Sales at Menlo Dental Transition, a national practice transition firm. He represents dentists across the country as they sell their practices. He's got his emphasis in MBA in finance, and before joining Menlo, he worked as a bank analyst and dental lender. And then he's been recognized as the nation's highest producing dental lender at First Citizens Bank. Then he came over, and let's see, various associations. He enjoys instructing small business owners on principles of finance, investing, and lending. Let's see, and gosh, you live in Arizona, and you guys spend your free time. I just golfing. It just jumps out at me golfing. I'll just point that out. So I asked David to join us just to talk to us about the landscape of what are we up against with, gosh, what are we heading into with markets and with lending and finding associates and whatever he thought was the hot topic for us to really be aware of as we move forward. So, David, thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate your time. Take it away.
Yeah, we're glad to be here. Hearing some of the different locations. I was born in North Carolina and grew up in Georgia, so I'm a Georgia boy,
Oh,
even though we live here in Arizona, and we broker across the country. Our largest presence is in the West here, I'd say, but we've sold practices in Alaska and all the way out east, and we do a good number of listings that are, to maybe corporate groups. Those don't really show up on the website, and those take place across the country. As a firm, we have just to kind of set the stage. We have a nationwide appraisal business that we're engaged in. We do appraisals all over the place, dental specific. And then we also have somebody that does associate placement. And so I don't do all that stuff. I'm just focused on representing sellers, taking practices to market. But we have the associate placement business and the appraisal business, and we'll draw on a couple of those things. So I did this presentation last night to a study club in San Diego, and then I flew back to Phoenix this morning. And so this is the last night was the first time I'd given it. So I was able. They were my guinea pigs. So now you guys get the good stuff.
All right.
We've got all the kinks worked out.
Awesome.
Am I able to share my screen? Let's see here.
Yeah, I have you down as co-host. Should be able to do everything.
Okay, we're gonna go right there. Let's share that. Let's see. Hopefully, did that work?
Yes, it did. Yep.
Okay. So this is a topic that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, kind of this idea of the practice life cycle, and a lot of this comes from the fact that as a broker, we tend to see a lot of the good, the bad, the ugly, and my goal is to just share some of those experiences here. So Zoltar is one of my favorite characters. When you're going on vacation, you see Zoltar, you kind of play the game and see what Zoltar tells you. I was thinking about as I was thinking about this presentation, 2020 really threw me as somebody in the industry and a lot of my clients, a lot of dentists that I work with, for a loop. And nobody, not even Zoltar, could have seen this coming. I mean, it's something that was extremely difficult to predict, and we had a lot of firsts. So 2020, we had money just getting airmailed to businesses, individuals. In a lot of cases, we had shutdowns. Maybe it's depending on your location. Maybe you weren't shut down, but the majority of my customers were shut down on some level for maybe a couple of months. California was especially bad. Then we saw the Great Retirement, where staffing got a lot tighter. Finding hygienists and some of those different things just became really difficult. And by the way, throughout the process, if you have questions, feel free to chime in. I'm going to try, my objective, since we're on Zoom, is to kind of buzz through these, and then we can go back and revisit some of these specific slides, or go through some Q&A. But I'm trying, buzz through these, but feel free to chime in if you have any questions. Don't hesitate to interrupt. So 2020, going through that time frame, there was a definite time of panic. At that time, I was wrapping up at the bank, and so I was doing everybody's PPP loans, and I had people calling me. And, maybe this brings up some post-traumatic stress, but I had people calling me with, yeah, what should we do? Should I pay my staff? Should I lay up? Should we lay them off? Or, just lots of, just a stressful time. And now it's kind of funny. As we take practices to market, we collect your financials. And 2020 just kind of looks like a blip on the radar, right? If you graph it out, it just looks like, oh, okay, there was a little down year, and now we're right back up. And in fact, it just excluded altogether from the analysis in a lot of cases. And so it's just interesting that little blip, now looking back, really doesn't tell the whole story. If there's one thing that's really lingered, costs are higher, the staffing environment's much tighter. I wouldn't say, even though practices seem to have rebounded fairly well, it's not the same, and it can be, it's still can be a challenging environment. So one of the things is, we've had several experiences recently that kind of caused me to put this together, this topic of deciding when to sell. And this is the one thing that I, as a broker, can't, and I don't want to answer for you entirely. This is a financial, this is an emotional, it's a family decision. It's much more than just, hey, here's your number, this is when it's ideal to sell. And we'll talk about some of these things, but this is one of those things. I realize in my role, and we would like for people to engage us earlier so we can make sure they're on the right path. But in a lot of cases, people don't really involve us until the ninth inning. I'm like the closing pitcher that comes in and we throw a couple of pitches and then that's it. The extent of my involvement is very small, and I acknowledge that. And we're just grateful to have the opportunity to work with your practice, the career and legacy that you built. And I fully acknowledge that, hey, selling is a personal decision. I'm never going to pressure anybody to sell and make that big of a decision, but I do want to give you some things to think about as you're considering what's the right exit time, what's the right exit strategy. So I did some teaching. I taught after I got my master's. I did a little bit of teaching online, and I noticed every semester there was this bell curve in terms of the performance of the class, right? There was always this bell curve that just kept showing up. I never had a cohort come through that was, all on the high end or on the low end. I thought for sure one of those semesters I'd just get a whole class of just geniuses, right? Like just kind of randomly. But it was always this normal distribution. I thought, what are the chances that every time I go to teach a class, the grade distribution looked like this? I'd have some lazy students at the low end, and I'd have some high performers, and then there'd be a lot of people right in the middle. It was like that 100% of the time. And so it's just something that's stuck with me, and I think about it in terms of dentistry and and kind of their career and the type of practice now. So this is, and just bear with me because I just made this up. This is not based on anything, concrete per se. It's just a concept that I'm trying to illustrate. So let's just assume, and I acknowledge too that this curve might spend a lot more time in that upper portion. You might spend a ton of time. It might go much longer. Your curve might kind of go up and then plateau for a much longer period of time and then start to decline. So this is going to represent essentially the value of your practice, which really consists of goodwill. Goodwill represents the bulk of the value of your practice, assuming solo dog, owner user, and we're going to sell to an owner user. So goodwill makes up the majority of that. So you'll notice it goes goodwill, then we have practice value, then there's kind of collection somewhere in that. And I realize there are a lot of other factors in terms of types of procedures and and location and all these different things, but just trying to illustrate, you start off the career, and then let's just say you never sell. You just kind of eventually kind of round that corner, and it becomes like over time it kind of starts to look like a maybe somewhat similar to a bell curve. So a couple of different things to illustrate on this example. We have a practice here where maybe the buyer purchases, so their goodwill is increasing pretty quickly while somebody else is tailing off, and then we hopefully maintain some continuity in the revenue and value of the practice, right? So this is just a simple illustration of that, and then hopefully here towards the end of the process for you as an owner, you can do the same thing, right? We can layer another person's curve on this at the end, where you can maybe start to step out of the practice, and then they can pick it up and then hopefully straighten out these lines to where the revenue and practice value stays the same, or stays consistent, I should say. There's another curve for what I would call the DSO or associate curve. The only thing that's really interesting about this, and again, it's not a perfect illustration, but it shows, okay, practice is growing, and then at some point this happens, these two lines cross, practice value and revenue can cross. And that's what's kind of unique. These other illustrations, if I go back, this is all pretty much assuming owner, user, buyer, owner, user, seller. So you're selling your practice, somebody that's coming in, just a normal person wants to buy the practice. This is going to be a corporate sales scenario, or let's multi-doc scenario maybe. This is not an easy thing to accomplish. This is generally going to be a larger practice. Very, very successful, good number of operatories, nice location. So there's a fairly narrow box where these things can happen, but it does happen, and it happens a lot. So the interesting thing about this is that we could see these two lines cross, practice value potentially in excess of collections. So this is the one curve. This was kind of the curve that I first envisioned as we were making this. And I just have dealt with so many people this year that have had sudden events that have impacted their ability to practice, and therefore their goodwill and their practice value, whether it be COVID. I have somebody right now just had a heart attack, and I get to have the most fun in my job as we're closing practices, and people are either retiring or doing whatever they want to do. And then buyers, I had a super fun conversation with a buyer when I told them that their offer was selected this week, and it was great. That's the most fun part of my job. But the worst part of my job is by far somebody has a stroke or has long-term COVID or something like that, and we're having tough conversations with spouses. I had the heart attack situation I had. This is a couple of weeks ago. I'm sitting down with the spouse of the doctor, and we discovered that they don't have any. There's really no transition plan. I mean, this all happened suddenly, and on top of that, there's no trust. They don't have a trust, and so most likely we're going to end up in probate if doctor does pass away. And so that's just a really I do not like being the bearer of bad news. Those are very uncomfortable conversations for me personally. And so there's things that you can do to prepare for your exit. The one thing that's interesting about this and the whole concept behind this is that the value of your practice is dependent on you. And so in some ways, I don't know if anybody here has seen the Top Gun already, and I'm not going to give it away, but there's a little portion of the movie where Maverick here, this is a great movie in my opinion. I just love it. But Maverick, he says, time is your enemy. And so when you kind of go back to this, in some cases it's kind of an odd thing, because your investment, the thing that might represent a good portion of your net worth, is in some ways kind of a depreciating asset, because it really depends on you, and we all get older and our interests change, or something happens health wise, and so time can in some ways be your enemy. And the one thing that I want to illustrate is, let's talk about managing risk just a little bit. So if time is kind of our enemy here, what are some ways where we can take some chips off the table, right? How can we maybe spread that risk out, especially if you own your real estate? So if you own your real estate and you own a practice, and most of your net worth is tied up between those two assets, you're actually in a pretty vulnerable position from an overall risk standpoint. In the banking world, we call that a concentration risk. And so the the idea that I find interesting is, okay, how do we take a little bit of risk off the table and spread that into other asset categories? And so I'm not an investment advisor. I'm not going to tell you exactly where you should put your money or what you should or should not do. But conceptually, if we're able to sell a practice before an event like this happens, in a reasonable time where you still have options and things, different things that you can do either for income or for fun or whatever your objectives are. Let's say you own your real estate. We have an opportunity to set up a lease, and then from there, and we'll talk a little bit more about real estate. And then from there, you may have the opportunity to sell that property to the buyer of the practice or to an investor, and then we can 1031 into other properties, do a tax-free exchange into some other properties. And in those types of scenarios, if you've been able to, let's just say, maintain your income stream through some other means, maybe it's working as we heard just previously, as a part-time associate for a friend or something like that, you've been able to maintain income. And then we've also received a windfall of cash, and we've spread out our real estate risk. And so that's the idea. So I'm not here to tell you when you should sell, but I am here to say, if you have a lot of your eggs in one basket, then we face some risk here. So we're going to talk about interest rates and a couple other things, but I wanted to pause. If there's any questions, feel free to speak up, and I will pause here for just a second, give you a minute to come up with any questions, and then if not, we'll just keep moving.
I have a question of, could you just share with me again why your real estate and owning your practice is a concentrated risk?
So, well, maybe the best illustration is through, my first experience was with risk concentration was working at a bank. And so we banks look at things and they're always looking for holes, right? Where's the risk here? And so concentration risk is essentially this idea that, let's just say you have a business that's making a lot of money, but they only have one customer. That's a concentration risk to that business. If that one customer goes away, then we have a problem. Yeah. And so going back to this, a lot of the value of the practice is supported by personal goodwill. So the concentration risk actually lies with you as the owner. You have to perform in a lot of cases. And so you yourself are the concentration risk. Even though you might have a diverse patient base and all those types of things, there is, if something does happen to you at some point, then you do run this risk of kind of being on a steep curve if there's a major health event or something like that. It's much harder to sell a practice if it's really dependent on you and something happens to you. And so yeah. That's kind of the idea, and especially if you own your real estate. I have somebody right now that scares me to death because we're going to market, but they have big practice, big real estate, and if we let the practice slip, let's say it's not as dramatic as this. Let's say it's something that none of these curves really represent what I'm about to say, but let's say it's a slower decline. In that scenario, we can't get as much on the lease because the practice can't afford it. And so now this seller is in a really bad, they're getting double dinged, right? So if they kind of enter that decline and try and sell the practice and the real estate, the lease income is inhibited by the practice because the practice only makes so much, it can only afford so much. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that.
Anybody else? Okay, we've brought you down. Let's bring you back up here now. We don't want to end on a depressing note here. So interest rates, I will say, if we were in person, I would ask our rates, our high rates, or which is better, high rates or low rates? And it was interesting. Last night as I was presenting we had about 30 doctors. They said low rates are better, and I disagree. Now, I'll say that's to an extent. So as rates have gone up recently, we get phone calls pretty regularly. hey, the Fed raised rates, what does this mean for me? The Fed does not directly impact long-term rates. It does have an influence, but when we hear about Fed raising rates, I think most of you probably know this, they're affecting short-term rates, and that can ripple through the economy, but the long-term rates are market-driven. And so back to Zoltar, our friend Zoltar, nobody really knows, nobody can reasonably predict market-driven rates, and a lot of rates in the dental business for buyers are driven off of the 10-year treasury. And so I would argue that it's not really so much high rate or low rate, which one's better. It's more so about the trend. So if we look at, this is as of a couple days ago, if we look at the trend of what's happening with rates, this is the 10-year treasury. Almost every bank is going to price off of this when it comes to dental loans to an extent. So the trend is headed up. So when a trend is headed up like this, what do buyers want to do? They want to lock their rate before it gets more expensive. And so I have 2 deals that went in escrow this week, and both of them were eager to get their letter of intent signed and to lock their rate with their bank immediately because of what's happening here. So even though the rate's higher, this is not to me, in my experience, detrimental to practice transitions at this level or at this stage. Now, if we go, this is a longer chart, same thing. So the chart that we just looked at is the very end here, right? So if we go back, this looks at the early 80s. We had rates. It's possible you could have borrowed at 20% for a practice loan in the early 80s. And so, that is coming off of an inflationary period that we're in right now. My hope is that we don't get to this level. I guess it's possible. I'm not Zoltar. I don't know. My hunch is that if we got rates up into this range again, that would be somewhat detrimental. But right here, living in this 3 territory, or if we're up to 5 or even 6 on a 10-year treasury or thereabouts, we're fine, because 10-year loans on a practice, even if it's $1 million loan, which is pretty common, it's on a 10-year amortization, we're not getting totally creamed on interest. On a 30-year home loan, it makes a much bigger difference because we're paying a lot more of that interest up front because it's such a long amortization. But on a 10-year practice loan, not as big of a deal. I have, for the first time last week, heard of a 20-year conventional practice loan, which I don't love, because then this starts to become more of a factor. Let's see here. 15-year practice loans are somewhat common, not super common. Most times this is going to be a 10-year loan. So talking about lenders, banks right now are sitting on a lot of cash. So this chart right here, this is from the Fed, St. Louis Fed. This shows demand deposits, so liquid deposits at banks right now. So we just hit a peak there where we're sitting. Banks are sitting on this is just liquid deposits, $14 trillion. Record number. And so right now banks have a lot of cash, and that's how they make money. They want to lend. So even though we've had rates creep up, even though there might be a little bit of fear and uncertainty, it's still very affordable. A change, a 1 or 2 or 3 point change in rates makes no difference in the underwriting of most loans for buyers. Again, at some point it does have an impact, but not a huge impact. And default rates are very low. So your established dental lenders, as I was on the dental committee at First Citizens Bank, and I got to see all of our statistics. There was a point in time where we had essentially 0 problem loans out of a portfolio of hundreds of millions of dollars. So this is, it's a good product. Lenders are going to be interested. Owner-user buyers are going to be interested in this. They're going to be interested in that product for a long time. Seller carry notes are uncommon unless, and this is kind of thinking back to the bell curve, most banks and buyers on an owner-user basis are going to be looking at certain types of practices. So if you fall on one extreme or the other, either too small or too large, then some of these things kind of get thrown out the window. So seller carry notes are uncommon for your majority of your practices. But if your practice is on the small end or on the very large end, then you can expect to have a seller carry note kind of come into play potentially on your practice transition. I'll pause there again. This is a big topic. Any questions on some of these specifics?
Just want to make sure I understand, is what you're saying is if you're in a position to sell, don't worry, because banks want to lend this money out. They're sitting on the cash, and people who are buying your practice will be able to get a loan.
Yeah, people are. So I've had some conversations that are interesting lately where we had a person come to our office, say, hey, I think the end of the world is near. I want to sell my practice now. And I'm just like, okay, I'm not going to change your mind on that. I have no idea. But what I can tell, all I can tell you is that when we look at this interest rate, just in terms of banking and rates, we are in a very safe place right now. And we have quite a bit of buffer. And this rise in interest rates actually spurs some action on the buyers. So that we're actually in a very good place right now. If we get to a super high level, then that is that is potentially problematic. Hopefully, we never get there. But the interesting thing about this chart to me is that it takes so long. I mean, there's almost a decade, if you look at it, where rates are above. This is just the 10-year Treasury base rate. Usually, we're 2 or 3 points above this on a retail rate. So there's a whole 10-year span where we're above 7.5% on the 10-year Treasury. And now people get accustomed to that. They get accustomed to paying those rates. And so I think maybe towards the end of this time frame, people were just accepting of it, saying, I'm going to buy my practice regardless. But, this would be, I think this is something in that range would be detrimental. It's just interesting how long it took for rates to come down after that spike. Anything else? Okay. So let's talk about exit options here. So we've heard, so we get looped into a lot of these conversations because of our appraisal business. So some people will engage us for an appraisal as they're trying to sell to an associate. And this has selling to an associate or a partner buyout in some form. I like these and I don't like them for some of the reasons that have already been mentioned. So these have a high success rate post-close. If you find somebody and you actually get to the closing table, a super high success rate. We're selling to a known party. Financing is easy. As a lender, I mean, these are no-brainers, right? There's very little risk on these types of transactions, and it's a very low-intensity sale. There's typically not a hard deadline that we have to meet in those instances. Some of these benefits are also the cons, right? Some of these things can also be problematic. So when you have a super long drawn out transaction, time introduces problems into deals and things happen and people change their minds, as we heard about earlier. So there's a lower, even though there's a higher success rate after closing, there's a lower closure rate, right? We see a lot fewer of these actually get to the closing table because it's more of an ambiguity ship. That's what we like to call it. It's more of it's really ambiguous how you get to closing. How do you decide on a value? How do you split up responsibilities and expenses and some of those different things? And so each one requires some careful attention. Each partner buy-in is just tricky. It's really hard to figure out. The buyer tends to have more negotiating leverage because they're in the practice and they think maybe they should get a discount for some of what they've contributed, which I think is probably fair in a lot of cases. But settling on a value is really difficult. Financing surprises. We see so many financing surprises where you have somebody, they're in your practice, everything's working out, and then they can't get a loan. And so you've wasted a year or two or however long with this person, and then there's a financing surprise. So, or as we heard, earlier, there's at least I think somebody commented on it, it's a surprise departure, let's say, where they're you think everything's great, and then all of a sudden they take another opportunity or buy a different practice, and those things happen so frequently. One tip, and I don't have a ton of tips, right? People engage us on an hourly basis to help consult on some of this stuff, but it's really tricky. One of the hardest transactions to do. Something that I've noticed that can help though is let's get an appraisal done, independent third-party appraisal done at the time, and even the two parties can split this cost, so it's kind of a fair number. But we get an appraisal when the associate starts. That way we know what our baseline value is before a new person comes in, and then maybe we do a little appraisal refresh at the time that the buy-in needs to happen. That's just one way to maybe help alleviate some of these challenges that we run into. That's not going to solve all your problems. It's just a tip or an idea. On an owner user, this is we call this our seller flowchart. It makes it look easier than it is, but and there's some big nuances to timing, some of these time frames depending on your practice location, if you're rural versus a bigger city, and the patient base, and this, and if your books are clean. If your books aren't clean, then you can basically toss out 21 days for listing onboarding. It can take much longer. So we, if we were to summarize it though, this is a good summary. So we do a consultation, listing gets onboarded, we appraise it, and we don't deliver, and when we go straight to listing, we don't deliver an appraisal. We deliver our end product is a prospectus that has a listing price in it, right? So it's more of a marketing document rather than a 80-page appraisal. So it's going to be, so we generally prepare a prospectus that's going to summarize financials, it's going to summarize staff, hours, procedures, those types of things, and then we do some marketing, pre-marketing of the practice to people that we already know are in the buyer pool in that area. Then it goes to full-blown marketing once, where ads, we sit down on each listing and prepare a marketing game plan, and hopes to solicit offers. So we get a letter of intent, negotiate through that process. Buyer usually has a due diligence period. We work on purchase contracts simultaneously, and we have pre-close, and I can't see the next one, but it's a post-close checklist where we have a checklist to help with some of the things that we're talking about earlier to get you across the finish line, but then have a smooth transition. And we'll talk some more about these things, how you can prepare to make this a smoother process. So that's to come. But are there any questions about this along the way? Okay, I find that if I pause for a longer period of time, there's somebody that tends to raise their hand eventually, so don't hesitate to interrupt me. I don't know if a chat would appear on my window or not, but
I will ask something just on the marketing side. Are you guys marketing practices all across the country? Are you focusing on a geographical area? How do you, maybe just some insight on that?
So our firm is a little bit different along those lines. Number one, we have a massive database, and dentists are nationwide, and so we can market just within our own database. But we need to go outside of our own database. Well, we have like the first set of tools is social media tools, right? Pay-per-click stuff, either on Google, Facebook, Instagram. We've utilized, and LinkedIn too. There's a lot of buyers that are on LinkedIn. Not many sellers are on LinkedIn, but buyers are, and so we'll utilize pay-per-click advertising, so we can get very targeted. So if it's in a different market where they maybe haven't heard of Menlo, Menlo's maybe not the household name, then there's ways it's easy to craft marketing along those lines just on a pay-per-click basis. And then from there, we do advertising in a lot of dental professional, specific places. Local dental society, a lot of them have email blasts that you can pay for, and homepage or classifieds, or if it's a legit dental society in the area, usually they have 4 or 5 ways to advertise there. And for each practice it's a little bit different. So for the listings that we have that are in the Midwest, where they're strictly selling to a DSO because it's too big of a practice, we don't do that marketing process. That is more of, we're calling up the top 10 to 20 DSOs and shopping that on an individual basis, and it's a slightly different process. So this is specifically owner user. It can look a little different on different types of transactions. So I think this is an important thing to address, and it's something that not a lot of brokers talk about. Maybe it's almost like you just kind of like turn a blind eye to this idea of like selling on your own, but it happens, and so I feel like it's a good thing to discuss. So can you sell on your own? Yes, of course you can. You don't need me per se. You can find a way to get across the finish line on your own, but here's a couple things to think about: pros and cons. Yes, you save on a fee. But the cons are kind of woven into some of these things that are important in the process, or at least that I see as important in the process. Creating a competitive environment amongst buyers is important. It's really hard to do that when you're selling on your own. Maintaining goodwill between the parties is important. I take a lot of bullets from people, buyers, sellers. I'll have sellers vent to me about something, and I ask them, like, is it okay if I just not share this conversation with the buyer? Like, let's just take a second to kind of process what's going on. And so it's an emotional time, and so sometimes It can be a difficult, selling a practice is a difficult process. It's not an easy thing. And so for me, it's, maintaining goodwill between the parties up to closing is a top priority, and also creating the competitive environment is a top priority. These two things kind of become in conflict with each other. That's something we spend a lot of time thinking about as a brokerage. If you're able to do that on your own, great. I just find that that's really difficult to do. Interpreting offers is important, and sometimes, especially when you get into a corporate offer, these are complicated documents. It's hard to know what's market, what's not market. I mean, there's a legal interpretation, and then there's also the, hey, this is what I've seen on other transactions. So this is not easy. And I know we've got attorneys in the room, so I'm gonna tread really lightly here. I'm gonna be careful and cognizant of the fact that there's a market for people that sell on their own, and there's a market for people that want to just use their CPA or attorney to get a transaction done. So I acknowledge that this happens in the marketplace. I will say that each person kind of has their different skill set or thing that they might focus on. So sometimes we'll see certain parties or certain representatives that want to assist have some gaps in the selling process, and it's just a matter of scope. And so I think as a seller, it's important to understand, okay, what's the scope of the service look like, and does that make sense for you? Do you need the full service? Do you need just limited scope? And that's where there's different parties. There's different parties that can address different things. In my experience, spending 200 hours plus on a transition is not uncommon. That's maybe more so the case for owner users. I mean, we spend a lot of time analyzing financials, presenting the information in a very clean format. And so the sellers that I tend to work with are folks that are interested in a little bit higher level of service. There's all types of different offerings. And that's not to say that they're good or bad. It's just what's the scope of what's taking place. Selling it on your own, confidentiality concerns, it's kind of tough. I mean, I know you can make a new email address, but then, how do we, it's tricky to maintain confidentiality if that's something that's important to you. And I tend to find without some outside influence or somebody that can help with the cadence of a transaction, it takes forever to close, and there's lower bank approval rates on some of these transactions. So I had these poor guys, they called me up, they had a whole deal worked out, they'd signed their purchase agreement, and they said, yeah, the bank told us we were good, but they're kind of ghosting us now. And so they're ready for some help. Literally, the whole thing was done. Lease was signed, purchase agreement signed. I mean, and we blew past closing date. Not we, they did. And then here we are with a bank that's gone dark on them. And so they call me for help, and I just happen to know the bank and the underwriters. And so I call them up, I'm like, guys, give me the straight story. What's happening? Now we're looped into this deal, like what's going on? And it turns out there were some major concerns that we could have, and the buyer and seller should have flushed out right before everything else they did. They should have flushed that out like first thing, not last thing, and it put them in a serious bind. So there's a process to things, and if you do it on your own, you do run the risk of some of those things. There's trade-offs, I guess. Owner user appraisal. So I talked about this a little bit. There's a difference between a prospectus and a full-blown appraisal. Prospectus is more of a marketing document. That's what we use to present your practice to the marketplace, and appraisal is more of a data-driven document, right? So if somebody comes to us for an associate sale and they just want to do an appraisal, and that's the extent of the need, we look at data drivers. Data drives the appraisal, and so we don't, if you're a certified valuation analyst, you have to follow some of these guidelines. And there's only a handful of certified valuation analysts in the country that specialize in dental, but it provides a solid basis and rationale with data that's behind the number. So it's some of the drivers are revenue, cash flow, the type of equipment, right? Well, mostly the big ones: CB, CT, CERIC, location, number of ops, procedure mix, stability of the staff, financials, lease terms, payor mix, technology. There's a lot of different things that will drive the data. A lot of people look for a rule of thumb, and you could say, oh, it's 70% of collections or 80% of collections. There are some themes that kind of do emerge, but really we have to let the data drive. On a formal owner user appraisal, the data drives that. As far as the type of valuations that get presented in a formal appraisal. We're going to look at book value, liquidation value. Those usually get tossed out because they're typically not relevant. There's some instances where they can be. And so the appraiser's job is to take the data drivers, and then pick which methodology makes the most sense. And typically they'll take 2 or 3, or they'll blend them in some form or another. So book and liquidation. So there's discounted cash flows. That one kind of comes up. Capitalization of earnings, and there's a market approach. Market approach gets used a lot. And this is one snippet of from an appraisal, just to kind of give you an idea as to what that looks like. So we filter it down to, okay, type of office, we're on the same page there. General office, multi-provider, no. So a single doc, PPO, fee for service. We tried to, and then we've got various number of operatories, digital, yes. So we're talking on the same terms there. And then if some of these are big outliers, you can assign different weightings to them. But we outline some of the major drivers, some of the data drivers, and then we know, okay, this is what the price of earnings is, or price to sales. And then this is one of the things that we'll use to kind of help us. So this is market data. These are actual sales that take place. And then this is a subject here at the bottom, right? So we're able to see actual transactions that have taken place and derive value with something concrete. It's a little different than the rules of thumb. So we talked about this. CVA is important. It can be super helpful. Appraisals can be super helpful for benchmarking. Like if you're thinking about selling and it's coming up in 5 years, like we love to have conversations well in advance. So appraisal can be nice for benchmarking. You can also stick it in your trust. That these things can be helpful. If something suddenly happens to you and you've got an appraisal that's been done in the last couple of years, that makes my life so much easier in terms of transitioning that office. If you're in a hospital and we need to jump in quickly, it enables us to go to market pretty quickly, and it's just a good thing to have. Not many people do it. Any questions on appraisal and some of these items? Nada. Okay. So these are some different options. My message is the decision to sell is yours. You don't have to sell. You can have a retirement office. You can build it up, ride the wave. And again, this is, that plateau period is probably much longer in reality. And then you can just ride the practice down. We can cut back to 3 days. We can cut back to 2 days. I have somebody that I'm working with right now. They've told me straightforward, I don't want to sell, but we need a plan on what to do and what happens. This is generally a little bit more riskier because of this tail end of the curve. What do you do about things like your lease? Do you sign a long-term lease? Do you not? Then do you go month to month? You kind of risk getting kicked out. You're kind of at the mercy of the landlord. There's a lot of challenges if you have a third-party landlord in a retirement office. But I realize that some of the clients that we work with and really love what they do, they love their practice, and they don't really want to sell anytime soon. What I find is that the retirement office scenario works. There's still a sale that takes place. We still get approached to sell these offices. It's just at a much lower value, right? It's after, we still get a lot of inquiries from sellers like, hey, I'm at this stage, practice is collecting, $300,000, and I'm ready to check out. So there's still a market for this, for buyers, but it is a slightly smaller pool if you elect to go this route. DSO sale. So we talked about this a little bit. This is generally higher valuation. It's based on a multiple of EBITDA. EBITDA is something that is really, and I don't want to steal anybody else's thunder. I know we're talking about DSOs later, so I'll be brief. But EBITDA is one of those things that, it's a straightforward definition, right? Earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, and yet it's not. When you go to sell, there are so many other things that go into your EBITDA, and oftentimes if a DSO approaches you off the street, you're not getting the full EBITDA, calculation that you could get if you kind of know how they look at EBITDA. And each DSO is slightly different. There's a lot of commonalities here, but there are some major differences. Usually, Usually they pay some amount of cash at close with various forms of holdback for upside, and you're talking a 3-year plus commitment. Oftentimes it's 5. Pretty strict purchase criteria and very complex offers. They tend to be double or triple the length of an owner user offer in terms of just the offer itself. I've read I don't know how many DSO offers I've read at this point. And even so, when I still get one, even if it's a company that I've seen one before, I still have to read through it 2 or 3 times. Like, okay, do I make sure I understand this? These are very, generally speaking, very complex offers. It's nice to have some help. Kind of talking about this, it's okay to pay for help. A lot of people want to cheap out and do things to save some money, and that's fine. I'm the same way. I'll be the first one to admit, I go to YouTube when things break around the house, and I'm going to try and fix it. So I completely sympathize with people that kind of want to go about it on their own, or don't want to use a broker, or don't want to use an attorney, or whatever. But there's a lot to be said about people that have experience doing this day in and day out, and there's things that we just see that that you just wouldn't see because it's not something that you're doing every day. And so we're not special. It's just something that we tend to have more experience in. There is, selling to a DSO, lots of pros and cons. I'm not really going to get into all those, but one thing that's really nice is less regulatory pressure, right? They take a lot of the brunt of the HR issues and things like that. And if there's a change in state laws or whatever, withholdings, all these, you kind of give some of that up, and in exchange you lose some control. The nice thing about this, and this is probably the biggest pro as we talk about some of the curves, right? The curves that I was describing. You can sell, get a windfall of cash, and maintain an income. And if you own the real estate, then we've secured that as well as a good cash flowing asset that you can get, gives you some options. So this is one thing that's really nice. You can do this still on an owner user basis. I've sold multiple practices this year where we sold the practice and the seller, and this is to just an owner user, but the practice has to be big enough. Maybe it's not in DSO land, but maybe it's just big enough to where the seller can work a day or a half a day or 2 days a week, whatever, and the buyer can afford to pay that. And so you can accomplish a lot of these same things if you have the right ingredients, even with an owner user sell. And we've had some people elect to do that. Earlier this year, we sold a practice. This one really stands out as we brought 3 offers. One from a small DSO, one from a large DSO, and then one from an owner user. And the DSO offers were actually higher. The valuation was higher. But when we got into all the details of everything that was taking place, they elected the owner user because it was more straightforward, and they felt more comfortable with that person as somebody to work back with. So these are some of the trends that are taking place. Now, this stops in 2017, but essentially what we're showing is that solo practitioners are in the decline in the dental business. It's been happening for a long time. The thing I don't like about this chart, frankly, is it makes it look like it's going to fall off of a cliff. But the reality is we're focused in on between 40 and 65% right here, roughly. And so, the chart is compressed, and it's sort of, I didn't make this chart, otherwise I probably wouldn't make fun of it if I did, but it's compressing, and it's distorting the number, making it look worse than it actually is. Yes, we're in a decline of solo practitioners. The numbers are dramatic, but maybe not as dramatic as this chart would like to make you think. Something that DSOs are doing, and you'll see more partnerships today versus DSOs. They tend to want to partner a little bit more rather than, so you in those situations tend to keep some ownership, and they operate behind the scenes, so they've gotten a little smarter in terms of how they transition. A lot of people when you sell to a DSO, a lot of times patients don't even really know or realize, and so they've gotten smarter, and it's just because there's interest from institutional investors. There's pretty big money behind it. Real estate considerations. This is, in a lot of cases, your real estate's worth more than your practice. We see this a lot. I'm affiliated with a commercial real estate firm, and so this is something where, a proper triple net lease can be worth much more than owner user real estate. So the real estate in some cases can be worth more than the practice, and then within that world, a triple net lease to an investor can be worth more than selling it to the owner user. So I have a seller right now. We went under contract this week, and he said, "Hey, I really don't want to be a landlord. I just want to sell the building to the buyer of the practice." And I'm telling him no for two reasons. Number one, it's a much bigger, more complicated transaction, right? So let's take a little bit of risk off the table. Buyer is accepting of a lease. Let's get a nice lease in place that gives us options afterwards. So let's give them right of first refusal. Let's get a lease that enables you to either sell to that person or to an investor, possibly, because there's certain clauses that the lease needs to have to be appealing to both markets.
Yeah.
And then from there, you need to get your practice closed, and then let's address the real estate in a different transaction at a later point. And then we can go to the marketplace. We can let the market drive what happens here. We can go get an offer from an investor. We can let the buyer use their first right of refusal. They'll be happy. You'll be happy. And so it's a situation where my job is to create options and to create a scenario where you have multiple exits and a clean path to getting closed. So we want to avoid having time introduced to the deal and selling the real estate with the practice. It happens a lot. I'm not opposed to it. If buyer and seller are adamant, like, hey, this is what it takes to get across the finish line, then we'll do it. I'm not going to say that cannot be done. I generally advise against it for those reasons. If you lease from a third party, this is one of the biggest sticking points. We see so many deals get blown up because of crazy lease terms where the landlord's not very easy to work with towards the buyer. So let's say we've got 2 years left on a lease, and we have to go approach the landlord. Hey, we found a buyer. They want to sign a new 10-year lease because the bank requires a 10-year term to match the loan term. So these are some of the sticking points I ran into. There are some crazy, this is the nuttiest language that we'll come across sometimes. So this was one that we had probably within the last month where the landlord requires the buyer of the practice to have 5 years of experience as a dentist. The lease says that they cannot bring a buyer to take over the space if they have less than 5 years of experience as a dentist. And the seller had no idea that was in the lease. They'd never even seen that. They don't often read the document, and they're big, they're long, they're complex. I wouldn't expect somebody to remember that if you signed a lease 20 years ago. So, but that's what the lease said. But furthermore, it also said that if they disapprove of the buyer, that they could be forced to vacate the property within 30 days. So right there's a huge out for the landlord. If they don't like the deal, then you're done. So they just took your practice value and just really. And so it's worth paying a professional to have your lease reviewed, make sure it's assignable, make sure we got enough term. If you ever make an improvement to your building, you need to go into your landlord and say, hey, I'm making this improvement to the building. Can I get an extra 5-year option to extend? Something like that, right? We need to never not have options to extend. We need assignable leases. This is such a big deal. How to prepare for sale. I think, yeah, we're getting there here. So we'll maybe have a couple of minutes for questions. These are some of my tips, and keeping in mind here, most buyers on an owner-user basis, they're gonna fall within this certain range right here. There's a certain sweet spot. They're looking for a certain number of ops. They're looking for certain procedure mix and those types of things. And then a lot of the value and where the banks are willing to lend also kind of fall in that sweet spot too. So, your sweet spot in your market might be slightly different, right? But bread and butter offices. A lot of bread and butter offices, 5 and 6 ops or whatever, kind of fall in this sweet spot here. Let's start planning 3 to 5 years out. Let's actually make a game plan for this. What do you want? What does your timing look like? Don't coast if we can avoid it. It's harder to sell practice in decline. Even though we do it all the time, it just gives us a little bit less leverage. We like having leverage on the sell side. I generally advise against incurring more debt, especially for equipment. So if you've never used a cone beam, you have no reason to buy a cone beam right before a sale. And so if you've never used a CEREC, you have no reason to buy a CEREC right before sale. If it's something that becomes integrated to your office and it has some time to kind of some seasoning, right? So if you do switch to using a CEREC or a cone beam, and you're doing the procedures that where it makes sense, then okay, that's fine. But it's typically you'll see that value happen over time. No need to go out and drop a bunch of money on equipment. I do like light makeovers. If your chairs need upholstery, may not be it's not the cheapest thing in the world to do, but that's a good use of money, right? So if your chairs are ripped, let's get those fixed up. If the paint is old, have somebody other than yourself go look through the office. Bring a friend through and have them take a look, because you just don't see your own mess sometimes, and you can get just get an opinion of somebody else, and make a list of, okay, is it paint, is it are there small projects that can be done? That stuff makes a big difference when we go to take pictures and show an office. We encourage people to clean up their discretionary expenses. The Costco bill, if you can avoid it, get the Costco bill out of the practice. And I don't judge people if they're expensing personal things through the business that have no real legitimate business use. I don't really care when I see that, but it's hard to get credit for that cash flow when you go to sell. So if you've got legitimate business expenses, and there's personal things that are commingled that are hard to separate, that's the stuff we need to get out of there. I have one seller right now that owns an airplane, and he puts the airplane through lease expense from another entity that he has. That is a very easy thing for me to add back, because it's clear. I know what my lease expense is going to be going forward. If we have supplies and a bunch of it is Costco or whatever else, that is really hard for me to separate. So clear accounting on that stuff is helpful, cleaning up those. If you're able to convert to digital, that's a good thing. Paper charts, most buyers, they are not accustomed to paper charts, and it's not a deal breaker. We sell lots of paper or partially paper practices, but if you can convert to digital, that's one of those things. Let's get your staff on it. Let's make the conversion and have that be one less obstacle. Lastly, and there's a lot more things that we could go through, but if this just comes to mind because it's such a recent painful spot in my mind, clean up your patient credits. If your patient credits have gotten out of control, clean them up. I have two practices in the last 6 months that we've transacted on where we go pull patient credits, and it's in excess of $300,000. Now they're big practices, they're fee for service, so there is maybe a rationale for why the number would be higher than normal, but not $300,000 worth. So and in both cases they were shocked. They're like, man, that's a big number. I'm like, yeah, that is a big number. So it's there's a lot that you can do well before, keep the patient credits clean, keep your accounts receivable clean. Any questions? Anything that we can answer? I know we've got
let's open it up.
7 minutes left for my time, so we buzzed through it super quick.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate it. That was awesome. Let's we'll stop your screen share, and then we'll be able to see everybody, and then let's get some questions about it. I have a question that I'll ask on behalf of the dentist. What should we be paying for a broker to sell our practice? What's a fee?
It really just depends on the scope of what's taking place, right? So if we have a DSO specific engagement, that's a very different scenario from an owner user engagement, right? So owner users, we're preparing a prospectus, we're hiring a professional photographers, we have showings taking place, we have lots of in-person due diligence visits, things like that. So full service on practices that are under $1 million, you can expect to be in that 10% territory. And then the prices go down depending on the scope of service that you have from there. So if we're just doing something DSO specific and it's a larger office, you can expect to be somewhere in that 6 to 8% range. If you want to take a small part in doing the showings, right? Like if you're interested in showing the office yourself, you can save some money there. So not every brokerage is the same. Some of them are just either flat 10% or flat 9% or whatever. Some of them have very limited scope. Our firm tends to fall on the more full service end of things. So you're going to see generally fees between 7 and 10% is kind of the norm, just depending on the scope that we're engaged to do.
Okay, cool.
Do you charge the buyer any percent?
We generally don't. Most buyers come unrepresented. They show up. A lot of times they don't have a somebody that they've previously engaged. That landscape is changing a little bit. There's a few more buyers reps out there today than I think there were even 5 years ago. But so occasionally, when a buyer engages their own rep, that rep is helping them look at multiple practices throughout the time. And so that the buyer's rep is compensated fairly, they'll typically charge that buyer a flat fee up front. So it's like, hey, if you want us to spend time with you, we will, we're going to charge you 5,000 or 7,500 bucks or whatever the number is. And then they kind of get access to this team of advisors for, looking at a few practices, but that's done generally well outside of what we're doing. My agreements are specifically with the seller, and in most cases, there's no upfront out of pocket cost. So we only get paid if the practice actually closes and everybody gets funded. So two totally different markets.
Okay, thanks.
I can ask just two quick questions. One quick and one not so quick. But the quick one is, you said the 10-year treasury is at about 3.3% right now, and that the loans that people can get to purchase a practice is 1 to 2 points above that. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep. That's going to be about, that's accurate.
4.5 to 5.5% in this market right now.
Now, keep in mind, that's where, that kind of goes back to the chart showing how much cash banks have on hand. Yeah. So when a bank has a ton of cash on hand, those deposits don't really cost them anything to lend out. So right now there's a promo coming out from Bank of America soon that's stupid, and it's well below that norm that we just talked about, and that's because they're sitting on a lot of cash. And so if bank cash deposits start to run lower, and then banks will in turn start borrowing to lend, and so once that borrowing to lend, then you're pretty solidly in that 1 to 200 basis points above the 10-year, because that's their cost of funds.
Got it. And then the other thing, you mentioned trusts a couple times.
Yes.
And about protecting yourself with trusts, and that's probably a bigger question than time allows. But just curious.
I'll be brief. So I'm not a trust attorney, so that's my first disclosure. I'm not your investment advisor or anything like that. If you do not, I'll use the example, my friend that had a heart attack, they did not have a trust, 69 years old. And so what happens when there's no trust, even if you have a will is not a trust. So a trust, you have to designate executor, there's trustees, there's a process that facilitates the next steps without you being there. Your spouse can take action on the practice sale and can sign on a practice sale and can do things at the bank and do everything else, right? They can continue operating without the seller's involvement or the dentist's involvement. So if you do not have that trust, it has to take a pit stop at probate. And when you go to probate, that is the worst place you could possibly be at that time when you're in need of quick action. That's when we need to be the fastest, is when something's happened and we're actually looking at that stuff. And we see this, this happens at least once a quarter to me, where we get a phone call and we have to do something. And so if it goes to probate, we could be waiting weeks, unless you have some friends in the mob and are willing to pay off the judge that looks at this stuff. You're waiting like weeks or months. California, it could be 9 months. And so that wait time is terrible. And so that's the problem that we're trying to avoid. And sometimes we'll see situations where there is a trust, but it's so old and out of date that it really has no impact on what we're trying to do. And so what happens is, and the asset itself, the practice itself, the number one thing we're trying to protect, is not even in the trust. So we have a trust and the practice isn't even in the trust, and we still got to go through probate. So if you haven't had that discussion with a trust attorney, that's just a no-brainer, super important, get it done kind of thing.
I'm just going through this with my father passing away a couple of weeks ago, and they did have a trust, and it's making things so much easier. And just a personal side to that is, we started looking into this. If he was going to be long-term in a facility, Medicaid can come back after the sale of your private residence and take part of that sale if you're the last surviving spouse in that residence, unless your home is in a trust fund. So you're absolutely right, David. Thank you for sharing that.
Melinda.
Yes.
Hi. Okay, a couple of questions. On these kids that are coming out of dental school, does the bank look at the income of the practice that they're going to be buying for them to qualify? Because a lot of them will have a lot of school debt. How are they qualifying?
So this is tricky. I spend a lot of my time interviewing buyers as if I'm kind of their banker to some extent, and then having conversations with their banker to figure out, okay, how legit is this person? Because it's tricky. The banker, the first person you talk to at a bank is usually not the decision maker, right? And so those people tend to overpromise a little bit. And so we are looking for some sort of matchup in terms of skills, liquidity. So the bank's requirements are pretty straightforward. They're looking for a certain amount of liquidity, even if they don't have to, even if they're providing 100% financing, they're looking for a certain amount of liquidity that the buyer needs to have for that type of purchase. 7 to 10% liquid cash. And I'm not talking family loans or anything like that. So they need to have certain liquidity. They need to have good credit scores. They need to have a production history. In a lot of cases, your more sophisticated dental lenders are going to ask for a production report, or at least a tax return from the buyer, and we can kind of back into what their production numbers are if we just know what their actual income is from the practice they've worked at. And so those are
new students getting out, or kids that were in residency or anything like that.
Yeah, so if you're brand new, you pretty much can't get a dental loan. If you're looking, so that a lot of those things, a lot of those parameters are going to apply for docs that have, at least a year, and most of the lenders are looking at 2 years of experience. Occasionally we can get an exception to that. If somebody is really strong on the cash front, and if they've only been out for 6 months, so we can already illustrate that they've got some production history, we can occasionally get around that. But for a brand new doctor, it's really tough. So most of the lending parameters are for folks that are, have a couple years of experience buyer wise.
Okay. Also, and how long do the banks typically finance those for the buyer?
Buyers typically a 10-year term. Yeah, 10-year repayment period.
Also on the fees of what you all charge, it's a percentage of, is it collections or what is it?
It's just a percentage of the sale, whatever the sale price ends up being. Yeah.
Yeah, sales yourself.
Yeah.
Okay. Production or?
Well, the value of the practice. So just rough numbers, $1 million practice collection sells for $750,000. It's a percentage, that $750,000, Melinda, that would be paid.
Okay.
Is that right, David?
That's right. Yep.
Okay.
Similar to selling your house.
Okay, that's it. Thank
Grant,
you.
I see your hand there, Grant. Yes, what you got? You got to unmute yourself. I think you're still muted there. On Zoom in the bottom left corner, if you
Unmute.
yeah, there you
Can you hear
go.
me?
Yeah, I can hear right through your computer. Yep.
Great. So this is a question for David. So do you have your own attorneys, or do you leave that up to the buyer or the seller to get an attorney?
Our preference is that each buyer and seller engage their own separate attorney. So I'm not an attorney by profession. That's not my training. Our scope is going to be really focused on bringing a practice to market, creating the competitive environment, understanding the terms, getting the right training. So I typically draw the line there though. And one thing that is nice is working with dental specific attorneys. They tend to have more reasonable fees for what we're doing. But I like it when buyer and seller engage their own separate attorneys. Occasionally I get some serious pushback from a seller like, oh, well, my cousin's going to do it for free. And I hate that. It's not a fun scenario. Get a professional that's in the business that knows what they're doing in the space.
That's a nice segue into Robert.
Hey.
Perfect. That was awesome.
Glad I could
Dr.
help.
Johnson's got a question there too. Oh, Grant, did you have another question?
No, that explained it. I would like to hear from the attorneys actually
Yeah,
about what their
Yeah,
roles are and
he's up
what's
next.
possible.
we got one of the best. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Dr. Johnson,
Great.
what was your question?
Yeah, I just wondered what he thought rural versus everywhere else as far as difficulty of maneuvering through a sale, or what's David's take on that?
Yeah, I'll go really fast because I know I'm cutting into other time here. But the rural practices can take a little longer to sell, but it kind of depends on what sort of rural we're talking about. So, there's rural with a population of 3,000 people, and then there's rural that's not too far outside of a metro area. So it really just depends on the location, but generally speaking, it does take a little bit longer. What I do find though is that those practices tend to perform really well. Like they tend to have higher margins, and there are some trends, pretty much thanks to COVID, there are some trends pushing people into more rural markets. And so a lot of spouses, if a doctor's spouse can work remotely, there's a lot more people that are considering those things. So it's not a bad thing. It's just something that can take a little bit more time, and we have a lot of rural customers, and it's just sometimes they sell quickly, sometimes they take a little bit longer, and it's good to be prepared for that.
Good question.
Good question. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
seeing a lot of people moving into the rural areas where I am, and also Dr. Johnson too. So this is awesome. Thank you so much,
David. That was awesome. Appreciate your
Yeah,
information.
I've got to go, but
Yes.
great talking with everybody.
We have your contact info for anybody that wants it. Absolutely.
All righty, thanks.
All right. Take care.